So, hello everybody. Thank you for joining once again. Today's Saturday Satsang. It's Christmas today. Merry Christmas to all of you who celebrate Christmas. And I'm sure everyone else gets to enjoy the fact that there are holidays nonetheless. So happy holidays to everyone. I might keep today's Satsang short, not exactly sure. Some of you have places, lunches to go to, etc. And some of us have already done all of that, and it can be a long day. So I thought, okay, what's the main message? Firstly, I'd put it in context that the talks are about something specific. Otherwise, you can listen to concepts, and there are plenty of reasons to disagree with concepts. Concepts that can be very appropriate relative to a certain objective topic in a certain context. And you can hear that concept, that idea. And if you don't know in what context it is being used and to what end, what the objective is, then it's very easy for the mind to go off and disagree with concepts because the mind is finding an environment, a platform, a subject where those concepts are not appropriate, where they don't apply. So right from the outset, I'd say the talks are about something very specific, and everything that is spoken about in the talk is spoken about and is used because it is relevant to that topic. To other topics, it may not be relevant. So what is the topic? The topic is peace of mind in daily living, or happiness for the human being. It turns out that happiness for the human being, according to this teaching, is continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. If we find ourselves in a state of continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in, that's when we would be able to say, not as a concept, but be confident to be able to say, if someone says, "Are you happy?" You go, "Yes, I'm happy." And to someone else listening, to a third person, maybe even to the person asking the question, what they might not know what that means when someone says, when you are saying, "Yes, I am happy," because their idea of happy is probably got to do with something like excitement or joy or pleasure, doing enjoyable things where nothing unfortunate happens, where you don't have to deal with hardship or things not turning out the way you want. That's usually what the untrained idea about happiness is, where life is pleasure. And therefore, because life is pleasure, 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 the person is happy. Whereas according to this teaching, it says happiness for the human being is available. Furthermore, not only is it available here and there, it's happiness is available on a continuous and unbroken basis. A happiness that doesn't come and go. And it's very important, the teaching says, I say, it's very important for us to, if this is going to start sinking in and bringing about change, important for us to know what in practical terms that happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis is. Because some sorts of happiness, if we have an idea of what happiness is, and let's say it's not happiness as described here, some forms of happiness I don't think are, and they're not actually happiness, but some people's idea of what happiness is, I don't think is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. And so if there is a happiness, let's call it real happiness, that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis, then if that's going to set in, it's pretty important for us to be clear on what happiness is, what this happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis is. And as at least we have an intellectual understanding about that, meaning we understand what the talks are about, that's when our contemplating and our observation of life, both the external and the internal, starts to become focused in a way that does start to highlight the functioning of our system that creates unhappiness, and on what basis or what assumptions about life that unhappiness arises. And we will then inevitably investigate the narrative and the assumptions that turn out to be our unhappiness. And once we've been told, which I like to do, that unhappiness is based on error, based on not seeing life clearly, based on an ignorance of who we are and how things work, we might then start to see that the unhappiness that is very deeply ingrained and arises regularly as an automatic response to how life is turning out, we might start to be able to put a tick next to the concept that says, that unhappiness that is based on the belief that the other is the doer, that I am the doer, and that in order for what I'm really looking for to one day be available, life needs to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's essentially, in a nutshell, the error, the misunderstanding that forces suffering, which is an uncomfortableness with oneself and a resistance with life, forces that suffering to keep arising because we keep saying, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, which is not true, but that's what's deeply believed. And so each time life doesn't deliver pleasure, we feel attacked by circumstance. We feel like this is not pleasure, this is pain. And pain is not what will deliver my completeness. My completeness will come when life is perfect. And so if that's a deeply ingrained assumption about who we are, that we are incomplete until life completes us through circumstance being perfect, if that's our deeply ingrained assumption, which means really that has to be a conceptual idea of self. It's what we can end up calling the psychological self. And it's not at all able to be seen as a psychological entity unless the light of awareness is brought onto it, and we start to appreciate that, maybe there is this deeply, deeply ingrained belief that because it's so deeply ingrained, we don't see it as belief. And that deeply, deeply ingrained belief turns into, or is what a psychological identity is. And the belief doesn't have to be true. The belief could be completely misguided. Imagine that, a completely misguided belief about who I am and what I need that is set in place as part of the life process. So it's essentially common to all human beings. A deeply ingrained belief about who I am, what I need, set in place by life, deeply, deeply ingrained from a very early age, let's say, and then forces that belief to respond to what is happening in life as if it's very personal, as if it's actually an attack on who I am. So this is really good news, because if what we really were that suffers in life is something unchangeable, something real, let's say. So if our real nature was to be at dis-ease with life, if our real nature was to be conflicted by circumstance, to feel attacked when life is not pleasure, then the fact would have to be that life is going to, by its nature, deliver suffering to the realness of who we are. And therefore, we'd have to say that suffering is an inevitable part of life, and that continuous, unbroken peace of mind, which really means the end of suffering, isn't available. If the real us was such conflicted as what I'm referring to as the psychological self. So the fact that it is a psychological self and not what we could call our real self is great news, because it means that there is hope for change to set in. And this is why in non-dual teachings, there is so much pointing on you are not the person. You are not the body. You are not the thinking. You are that which is real, that which is absolute, that which is unchanging. So if you look at a lot of wisdom teachings, and I guess all teachings are based on wisdom, but there comes a point where you can sort of see, okay, this teaching, not this one in particular, although I do think this one in particular, but there's a whole range of teachings, can say, well, this is, I guess, not basic, not, because there's a range of seekers, there's a range of people in life, and can't expect everyone to resonate or understand, be ready to receive any teaching. So if you get to a teaching that is designed to be delivered to someone that has gone through a fair amount of change, you'll see that the teachings are not focused so much about do this and don't do that. So earlier teachings for people that really aren't ready to receive, aren't able to receive, I guess, a teaching I'm referring to here, will tell the seeker what they should and shouldn't do. At some point, you might start to see there's teachings that stop telling you what you should and shouldn't do, and they're just not going to work for some people in life. If you took away the direction, they'd just spin off the rails. So direction is appropriate as a teaching for a group of seekers, let's call people seekers, whatever. At some point, that teaching becomes completely inappropriate for a specific group of seekers. When the seeker has changed enough, then there is a need to say it's not about being told what you should and shouldn't do. It's rather about coming to see what you really are. And that means more of a connection to self, and automatically, as that connection to self happens, we will function differently without being told shoulds and shouldn't. So if you took a set of precepts that say this is how you should and shouldn't act, let's take the 10 commandments. Do this, don't do that. At some point, they stop being a set of prescriptions and they turn into a set of descriptions about how you function based on a deeper connection to the true self. But at first, on first glance, they will seem like, and for some people they are, instructions. Don't do this and do that. Prescriptions. When the teachings start pointing at the depth of who you are and there is a connection to that, there's no need to tell someone what they should and shouldn't do, because that entity, any entity, is always really expressing who they are in that moment, or who they think they are, or who they have gone. If someone's gone beyond the psychological structure, then they are functioning from a different place, but nonetheless, it's still a structure, and the functioning will become much more spontaneous, much more natural, or much less conditioned by ideas. There's a flexibility in the man of wisdom, woman of wisdom. And then it will say, and a man of ignorance will X, Y, and Z. So it has descriptions about how a connection to self functions and how the psychological self functions. So those descriptions about the two start to allow us to see what parts are functioning, or see are functioning, and then see if we are functioning according to the descriptions of the man or woman of ignorance or the man or woman of understanding. And it's not so much about judging ourselves. If we find ourselves moving, being moved, being lived in a way that describes the movements of a person, man, woman of ignorance, with, let's say, attachment or strong desire, seeking after pleasure, and we see that, it's not about judging, it's about saying, okay, that is the part of me that is based on what's the psychological identity at play. Now that's a great step forward, actually, to see it. So if we can find ourselves seeing it objectively without judging ourselves for it, basically saying, that is the story of life, what has been predetermined, unfolding at this point in time, the part of us that is seeing that and not judging ourselves as the doer is now functioning as the person of understanding would function. That part that is saying, yes, this is how it is, I see it. The part in us of the psychological entity would see it and not want to see it, or see it and defend it and say it's because of this, and not see it objectively, just as a happening. So the non-dual teachings are often pointing to the truth of who we are, the real self. And that real self, or at least the essence of the real self, is prior to, or is not, what we experience ourselves as. What we tend to experience ourselves as, historically, or as a result of what has been put in place, is the body, the form, the thinking, and the emotions. You are not that. All of that is of the relative realm. Thinking comes from an instrument that you can see can be damaged, the brain can be damaged, and then the thinking function can become much different to, let's say, when the brain is not in the damaged state. So it shows us that thinking is the output of an instrument. And so then you'd say, well, if the instrument can be damaged, then maybe it isn't in its undamaged state. Maybe it's not some absolute optimal, but maybe it is just on a spectrum of optimality. So that means even what we might consider normal thinking, ordinary thinking that's based on information about stuff, about the world, even if that thinking is not damaged by, whatever, a stroke or something like that in the brain, it too is simply an output of an instrument that then you compare it to another undamaged brain, let's say, and that person might have more information, more capacity. So we start to see that brains are relative. So even if you took, let's say, Einstein or some of the most IQ endowed people in history, if a bit like a computer, we look at a computer, and if you imagine a computer in 50 years' time, or you compare a computer now with a computer of 10 years ago, there is a difference in capacity. So if you imagine some other species of alien, let's say, they may have an IQ that's way beyond what even an Einstein type person might have. And why is that? It's because the instrument is different, or the information that the instrument has received is different. So this is very important, this principle, for us to understand that thinking is the output of an instrument that in itself is very relative, not absolute. It can be damaged. And even if it's not damaged, it has a limitation to its functioning capacity. And furthermore, the amount of information that it is being fed is different for everyone. You might think a certain way about a certain topic. One day you sit down and you read a lot about it. Someone explains stuff that you hadn't thought about, and you might come out at the end of that day with a completely different understanding, or much more developed understanding about the topic. So we get to see, well, from just in the space of a day, maybe in the space of 2 minutes, when some insights happen, the thinking that we have can change radically. And that shows the relativity of it. It shows the changeability of it. It shows the limitation of the fact that we thought we were full bottle on something, and then we got given more information, and someone showed us a different perspective, and we became, let's say, even more informed or more understanding about the topic. And it shows us what I thought was a great understanding turns out not to be. And even that new understanding that we might think, oh, now I've got a great understanding. It's never absolute. Our thinking is not absolute. And the same with our emotions. Our emotions are completely dictated by the conditioning and the instrument. And the same with anything to do with the body. So the brain is part of the body. So thinking, emotions, physical attributes, physical feelings, all of that is relative. It's based on your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. And to know the part of ourself that can be at peace on a continuous, unbroken basis means to go beyond identification with that part of ourself. What that word identification in this context means, because sometimes I use identification in a different context. So in this context, identification means where we only know ourselves as that, where we have no other reference of anything else that we could say is who or what I am. So identification with form, identification with the relative, means identification with the body, the emotions, and the thinking. And when you think about it, the truth is that the way humans develop and go through life, essentially feeling, experiencing like I am this physical entity, and I have my ideas, my thoughts about this topic and that topic, and I feel this way about that person and about these situations. And that tends to be how we know ourselves. You know, this is my house or my room. I go into the room, I get onto the bed, I go to sleep, I wake up in the morning. So there's this self-referencing ourselves as essentially the body and the thoughts and feelings that arise, let's say, in that body. We're not that. Truth is a word that's often used, and truth is something that is not relative in the context of these teachings. Right? So someone could say, well, you know, kind of a truth that is in itself very relative. And so what they're talking about is a concept that is true, and yet it's still a concept, so it's relative. So that's why if we're talking about truth in relation to knowledge in the world, we can say that is a true idea. Let's say that apples are a fruit. We could say that is a truth. It is accurate. It's a true concept. And if we said, you know, apples are not organic, that is not true. And so someone would say, well, the truth, which is apples are a fruit, that is in itself, that is relative. In the context of spiritual seeking, truth is a word, a concept used to talk about something beyond the relative. The absolute is the opposite or the counterpart to that which is relative. So if something is absolute, it is not relative. If it's absolute, it doesn't change. If it's absolute, it is not subject to coming and going. So the body comes and goes. You can look at it, you know, second by second basis. Each second, the body has changed. So the body has the body that was there a second ago is gone, and a new body essentially is there now. It's different. You can look at it as the body comes and it goes. You know, the body of you when you were 5 isn't there when you were 10, isn't there when you're 50. That's essentially the same principle. The body is always changing. It's just expressed on a greater time frame where that becomes more apparent to us. Because if we think, oh, my body has come and it's gone on a second by second basis, can be a bit hard for our intellect to grasp as to what it means, because it doesn't appear to have changed. It doesn't appear to have come and gone. Or we can look at it on an even longer time frame and see you were born and then you die, and the body has turned from being a physical body into from dust to dust. The thoughts come and go. You're thinking about food 1 minute, and then you're thinking about the noise outside the next minute. And then you might go back to thinking about food. You can feel excited 1 moment, and then that excitement goes and you can feel flat. So all of these things come and go. So you are that. You are that which is unchanging. you are that on which everything that comes and goes is dependent. Things that come and go don't come and go in isolation or independent of what you are. So what you are is here now. Anything that comes and goes while it is in the come stage, it is present. It is present, and you are present. And it never exists while you are not present. So everything that comes and goes is actually interdependent on the unchanging part that is what you are. The consciousness, the awareness. That which is not of form, doesn't have an age, it doesn't have a gender, doesn't have preferences, it doesn't think. Thinking happens, but that which is the absolute is not the thinking. What you are might notice thinking, trying to think about what it is. And the thinking about what I am, which is not relative but absolute, that is more thinking that is relative. It's happening, and that's not what you are. So the whole experience of life, including the body, what I mean by the experience of life, I mean the visual objects, which includes the body, the hands exist as a visual object, and the legs. And just like a tree is a visual object and a chair is a visual object, at least that's one layer of the experience of life, is the visual object. And then there's a layer of sound objects. And then there's a layer of touch objects. And the layer of smell and taste objects. And the thought object and the emotion object. And if you put all of those objects and you layer the slides, so you look at it like a pane of glass with all the visual objects, a pane of glass with all the sound objects, a pane of glass with all of the taste and touch objects and thought objects and emotions, and you stack them up one by one and see the whole image. They all mesh together perfectly to create what we know as life. The life experience. It's a whole set of objects. And there is something present that is aware of that experience. And looking at it like this, you might see the experience of life is something that is always happening now in this very moment, where all of the sight objects, the sound objects are arising as a freeze frame that is continually being replaced by a new freeze frame, by a new freeze frame, by a new freeze frame. And because that is happening, there is the experience of life as we know it, which appears to be very different, appears to be a continuum a time continuum. So we have ideas about what happened in the past and who I am that made all of these things happen. If we are going to know ourselves as the absolute, know ourselves as that which doesn't change, it's very important for attention to come into the present moment and appreciate that there is an experience of life, an experience of a human being, a physical object, a body in a world of form, but that it is an experience in this moment. And that experience is awared, registered, known by that which we are, not by the body. I know it feels other than that. It feels like the body knows. That is identification with the body. The essence of the human being, or the essence of what we are, consciousness, awareness, is not the body. And because life has always felt like the body is aware of the table or the tree or the other people, then the assumption based on how the experience feels is I am the body. It is the body that knows the world. The body is an object. The body can't, an object can't know the world. And so for as long as there is the assumption that it is the body that knows the world, then that which really knows, and what I mean by knows is aware of, that remains hidden. This is why the teachings say you are not the body. You are not something that is born and will die. And thinking is trying to think our way to knowing this that is being pointed at. I know it's the habit. It's like, oh, well, the body will know what is being pointed at through its faculty that it has used. What I am is the body in the thinking. So there is a habit to obsess over thinking about what is said. And at some point, hopefully the thinking says, because the teachings, the concepts will say, thinking is never going to be able to know that which is prior to thought. That which is prior to thought, that which is what we are, is here now. It exists. It's just that the identification with the relative is so strong that those functions keep happening in an endeavor as part of the seeking. I need to find who I am. And so it's those functions that keep happening. And that essentially keeps the objects, because of the identification with those objects, center stage, and keeps that which we are in the background. So the hint is that thinking is never going to know that which is prior to thinking. And this is very frustrating, this part of the seeking. If what I'm pointing at, what I'm talking about, if there's no frame of reference, no sense of it, I know it's very frustrating, because it's spoken about as, this is very important, this realization, this awakening to this aspect that is what we really are, is the key. And if there's no sense, which often there's no sense because the identification that might not even be seen as identification just keeps trying to figure it out, and it is in itself, it is the obstacle, it is the veil. And so it can lead to a lot of frustration. And so that's why a different teaching to a teaching that sort of is a bit devoid or disconnected from the world of practical daily living, a different teaching then is more appropriate if someone finds that block. A teaching that reframes it and says, actually, the issue is the thinking about the other as the doer, and that has its place. That's sort of the other side of the misunderstanding that has to get worn down. I think both need to happen eventually. And so what can happen if we listen to one, we resonate with one, is we can forget that there's something else, another side needs to be looked at. And if we only look at this side and come awaken to that which is not form, not thought, but that which is the background of all life experience, if we find a connection to that and awakening to that, and we never look at the thinking, just knowing ourselves beyond the thinking, and yet certain patterns of doership and attachment remain in place, there's going to be a whole lot of flip-flopping that happens. And the seeker is going to think the flip-flopping is happening because I'm not deeply immersed in the self yet. And I would say that the flip-flopping happens because the other side of the coin, coming back to the relative plane and working with that, hasn't happened. And so on the relative plane, the doership and the attachment to outcome is still in place. So even though a seeker, has connected to the part inside them that is still and outside of thinking, very frequently they're going to get pulled out of that into circumstance and find a disturbance happening, and eventually they'll find their way back to this silent space, but never really dealing with the thinking, because that other teaching that is very important says it's got nothing to do with the thinking, it's about connecting to the depth of who you are. So hopefully, given I've now flipped this and brought in the other, we can see it's not about one or the other, it's about both coming together, finding the part inside of ourselves that is silent, still, prior to thinking, prior to form, and then also realizing that we have to live life as if we are the body, as if it is a world that is real, have interactions with humans, and that it is the belief in doership and attachment that continues to create the suffering in its different forms, guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, and that just resting in the self isn't going to magically dissolve those tendencies of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. What it means is that there will be time when they won't be present, and yet when circumstance kicks up, we will get dragged out of that place, and we will find the guilt and the blame kick in, unless the work on that side of the coin has been done too. So continuous unbroken peace of mind, which is what I started with, really means the end of guilt, the end of blame, which are mental movements based on the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. And that means living as the human being, as the person, without that thinking, without pride for the things that we have been successful at, knowing that really it was good fortune, our destiny, that it worked out, that we were given the gifts, the capacities to do that. And hopefully we've seen that there are plenty of things that we're not so good at, that don't always work out. When we think otherwise and pride sets in, the saying is pride comes before the fall, which really means, sure enough, if someone is proud about what they've achieved, saying, I am the doer of this, life is going to show them soon enough. So pride has come before the fall, is where life shows you, hey, here you go, you didn't succeed at this, did you? So that's it. You can feel proud about something, and life will show you soon enough. Then the end of guilt, the end of blame, the end of pride. Those three are based on the attitude towards oneself and the other of personal doership, having come to realize that on the relative level, everything is just happening according to destiny, according to creation. And that becomes much easier to see when there can be a resting in the silent, witnessing consciousness that is witnessing the body and the thoughts and the emotions and the actions of oneself and of the other from the place of knowing itself not to be those things. When the witnessing consciousness, when we know ourselves as that which is witnessing life happening, then the thinking is very clearly not what I am doing, but rather what is happening. The speaking is from that place of witnessing, not what I am doing, but what is happening in this moment. And someone will say, well, in that case, who is doing it? Why does there have to be someone doing it? Why can't it just be happening? It's like if a boulder is rolling down a hill, a boulder is rolling down a hill, it's happening. There's no doubting it's happening. But does there have to be someone doing it? And hopefully we can see, no, it can be happening according to the convergence of all the forces in that moment that is forcing that to be the only thing that can be happening. And in the same way, the speaking and the thinking and the irritability or the excitement, everything that happens in a moment in life is exactly that. It's happening because of creation being the way it is. That creation is dictating, is driving what is happening. And we've become identified with the body, and that means feeling like I am the driver of the body. And so from that point of view, the happening of the body can't be seen, because in each moment where there is a narrative inside, a narrative supported by how the experience of life is from the place of identification, there isn't any advantage of seeing things just happening. And so it doesn't make sense that that would be the narrative that gets set in place. The experience actually says you, the body, you are the thinking, and you are making your actions happen. So it makes complete sense that that is the attitude that people have about what is happening in life until certain shifts happen, until things start to be seen differently. Is it true that you think this way because of your genes, meaning the body structure and how it's grown up, and the brain and its capacity to think about things, and the up-to-date conditioning, which essentially means the information you have received on a cumulative basis from inception up to now, and that new information is like information being absorbed by the hardware, and the two then become essentially one. The hardware and the software are one thing in each moment that sees something a certain way, that understands something a certain way. And so we say, oh, that's who I am, and I am the doer of my thinking, of my understanding, whereas it's a consequence, really. It's a consequence of factors that none of us have ever been in control of. I wasn't in control of my genes, meaning the hardware, and I wasn't in control of the information that was received, the conditioning, essentially. Information is conditioning. And the cumulative conditioning that happened moment after moment after moment for years and years and years and years is what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So new conditioning will add to or radically change your up-to-date conditioning. And so some of these concepts, make no mistake, Ramesh used to say, make no mistake, what is being shared in Satsang is simply new conditioning that will become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And certain new conditioning is radically different from the conditioning in the past, and it can dismantle a whole lot of the past conditioning. I was going to bring it to a close, but I see Frank has his hand up. So I'll just take Frank's question and then see you next week. Hi, Frank. Oh, hold on a sec. Although, who knows? Sometimes Frank puts his hand up and walks off. Are you there, Frank?
Okay. Hey, Roger. No, I couldn't unmute myself. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, very well.
Okay. Thanks. Well, thank you so much for this this satsang on a day like today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I had a small question for you. I actually wrote it on the question in the chat, but I'll just read it to you. So what I was wondering about today as you were talking is this whole idea of the tantric versus the Vedantic. And I know I sometimes can get lost in words, and I know that's the mind trying to figure things out. But having said that, is all the topic that you brought up today of bringing together the relative and the absolute, is it related to what other teachers talk about when they talk about the Vedantic versus the tantric approach to reaching the true self?
Yes, you could say that. I mean, the Vedantic approach, not entirely, but the Vedantic, a slice of the Vedantic approach, because I think Advaita Vedanta is misunderstood, really. It's by well, I don't understand it. I'm not a Advaita Vedanta scholar. But I think we, as we've come to understand it in the West, we get a slice of what Advaita Vedanta is, which is the more esoteric, non-practical, non-relative part of it. What I was speaking about today, the formless, and it sort of leaves the body out of it. But I think Advaita Vedanta, as it's practiced properly, like if you were a monk in an Advaita Vedanta school, which most of us in the West definitely aren't, we'd find that Advaita Vedanta is much broader than what's been popularized. And it doesn't necessarily leave that student that is going through the specific regime of Advaita Vedanta as a very methodic process, which, if you were a monk in one of those schools, there's a lot of study. It's probably less absolute than we think. There's a lot of parts of it that will deal with the relative. But when it's referred to in the way you're talking about it, I think we're looking at the part that says, well, Advaita says you are not anything to do with the body or the world, but you are that which is, prior to the world, or that which is real and the world is unreal. Let's say that's what Vedanta is saying. And Tantra is a path in and of itself, and it's using the body as the doorway. It's getting you to come into the body and to feel, which can seem like a complete contradiction to Advaita. And so a student of Advaita or a student of, I am not the body, will say, will listen to it and say, that's getting it completely wrong. But really, there's rationales as to why the various approaches take the approach that they do. And so even though on the surface, telling someone to come into the body and to feel emotions, feel energy, feel all sorts of things and push boundaries with intimacy and things like that, might seem like it's completely off track on the surface when processed through a sort of fairly limited, let's say, if limited perspective. From another point of view, if you understand what the problem is, if someone understands what the seeking problem is and says, that the tantric approach is addressing it this way and it's trying to undo the knot this way, then we can say, well, they're not really that contradictory, but rather different ways of addressing the different layers. So yeah. And having said that, Ramana is said to have had a fairly tantric component to his awakening. And yet, generally speaking, if someone was to categorize Ramana, they'd say, he's Advaita, non-duality. But what often happens in someone's path is they have a primary path, and then some of the other paths like bhakti or tantra or karma yoga can come in and play a role, and that role is maybe a bit secondary. So there's the primary path, but it's supported by other or aspects that would fit into a different primary path. And so that's, Ramana was said to have a fairly tantric awakening.
Great. Thank you, Roger. I did have another question, but I don't know if you want to just go off, because it sounds to me like you want to end this today. If not, I would like to ask another question, just but that's up to you. I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Well, and I'm not sure how deep you want to go into this, but I have a question about creation and what your thoughts are on creation. What religions, when religions talk about creation, and how we as men, let's say, the Bible talks about man, God, and man, that we're created. But I've recently heard somebody I was listening to talk about how, we cannot be created, because we're part of what creates. We're part of a consciousness that creates, which I found really, really interesting. And it seemed to be, it kind of strikes me as true, that take on that. What is your take on that?
It very much, different teachings that are aiming at different levels. So if you can see that if you take the two teachings that I tend to put forward, that you are not the body, you are consciousness, that thinking needs to stop at some point, and there just needs to be a being of what's here, what is real, what doesn't need us to think it into existence. There's all of those explanations, and then and none of those explanations are referring to the body or the person. They're referring to something essentially on another dimension, outside of, beyond, more real, encompassing all of those other things, the body and form. And so it can get very confusing when if I flip and I talk about teaching from different teaching, in a way that says, you are a person, and you've got certain ways of looking at life. There's the attitude of doership and the attitude of attachment to outcome, and that is what creates guilt and blame and pride. It can, unless we separate them out, it can get very blurry, because on the one hand, there's no talk about being the person, and then on the other hand, there's you are the person. And so in the talk about creation, when you talk about we are part of creation, it's really saying we as the human being, as the body, are part of creation, and creation includes the other animals, the other people, the sun, the oceans, and all of that was created by God or by Source. And so someone who's approaching it from, I am not the body, I am not the anything to do with the physical, I am the absolute. If there is an awakening to that, then essentially you awaken to what can be referred to as Source within the context of that teaching. And so then that seeker that has awoken to, let's say, something that feels or is more absolute, won't be able to understand, or won't be able to agree with the concept that we are part of creation, because they've started to identify themselves as that which is beyond creation. Creation to them is that which is arising in the present moment, witnessed by what they are. Not witnessed by the body, but witnessed by the silent awareness that is, in those teachings, said to be Source or God or truth. And so then the thinking, if the thinking believes that absolutely, it's like, oh, what I am is this awareness that I have that there has been an awakening to, and that is the absolute, which means there's nothing beyond it. There is nothing to create it. If I am what I have awoken to and know myself as is believed to be the absolute, which is what I was saying in the teaching, in the first part of the satsang, then the notion that someone else comes in with and say, hey, we are part of creation, won't make any sense to that seeker. Now, the problem is it won't make sense to the seeker because in order for the teachings to be effective, they need to say some things that are not that absolute, but they need to say them in a way that says it's absolutely like this, which is a minefield in a way. It all works itself out if we're lucky, because it can't be other than that. That, you know, a teaching that's taking this approach can't but go in and say it is absolutely like this. It has to go in and say it is absolutely like this. You are not the body, you are awareness, and awareness is source, or awareness is God. And that works. It creates awakenings. And then in that moment, when the awakening happens, the thinking, there is still thinking happening in that space. And the thinking is, oh, I am not the body. I am that which is aware of the body. And that's good. That's reinforcing the awakening, and it allows a grounding to happen. And at some point, that becomes a belief that might keep that person from processing a statement from someone that says, oh, we're all part of the creation. If their position of knowing themselves as awareness, accompanied by the deepening belief, oh, I am not the body, I am awareness, and awareness is source, then that belief is going to make them very dogmatic, and it's going to make them essentially very disconnected from the relative. And we see this in a lot of non-dual circles, not because the person is completely deluded. I mean, they are, but delusion is really an ongoing part of being human. It's because the top-down teaching has done its job to some extent in having created an awakening. So I think a lot of people in various non-dual groups that keep insisting and saying these very dogmatic things are saying it from some actual first-hand awakening that seems to tell them, and does tell them to some extent, what the teachings have been pointing out: you are not the body. But the problem is the teachings sound like and are taken to be truth, and maybe they're not exactly that. So I don't know if that helps, if that explanation helps. But that's why I think you had this, you would have had this disagreement, let's say, between the 2 points of view. We are part of creation, and then, oh, we can't be part of creation. We are the creator. And so as I see it, I guess that's what you've asked me, is having gone through those various stages, which is why I can speak about them. I speak about them from experience. And it's one of the greatest gifts I found was coming to meet Ramesh, who, having gone through it himself and was lucky to be very practical as a person. He was a banker for the Bank of India, ended up as their general manager. He said, as a general manager of the Bank of India, I had to be practical. You can't run a business, a money business, if you're not practical. It's a sure recipe for disaster. So the fact he'd spent his whole life having to be practical, meaning you can't go off and get lost in concept, meant that he came to seeking through his Hindu Brahmin background, where there were family gurus, Advaita was there, and especially once he met Nisargadatta, that is very much top-down teaching. And I think, and he had these awakenings and realizations that happen when various pointers are given to you. Actually, the teachings can be very dogmatic, right? And they need to be. And you have the awakenings. And then at some point, I think Ramesh, after having these awakenings, say, well, do I live my life saying I'm not a human being, knowing myself as, I mean, it's not just, you're not just saying I'm not the human being, you're actually, the experience is you're not the human being. And it can be very easy to get lost out there in that perspective. And I think Ramesh was fortunate enough in that the practical part of him said, yeah, that might be the truth, but still, this is the game. This is the creation. The creation was a creation of being human. So it's not the winning the game, let's say, is not to go around and say, hey, it's a game, it's not real, and keep pronouncing that. We sometimes think that's what it's all about, is to call it out, see that it's not what it appears to be, and then keep calling it out. But we might then say, oh, we might then realize, oh, maybe it's about playing the game where we even sort of forget it's a game. So a bit like an actor acting. The actor doesn't keep saying when he's halfway through his scene, oh, but I'm just an actor. I'm not really, I don't know, John Smith. I'm just an actor. When you're acting and doing the John Smith role, the actor has to be John Smith, fully John Smith. And all the script is just about John Smith and what John Smith is doing. And the integration, I think, after the awakening and the various realizations is then one of coming back to not fighting life and having to keep saying it's not real and it's an illusion and all that. And you find that the changes have been made and you can just come back. And that's why we have to say, so in practical terms, what are you really looking for? And in this, while a seeker is seeking in the top-down approach and finding the truth and being pointed at, you are not the body, you are that which is the absolute and unchanging. At that point, we're not interested in what am I practically looking for. It's I'm looking for the truth. And then you might say, why are you looking for the truth? And it's like, that seems like a silly question. It's the truth. So obviously that's what's most important, truth. And once the truth reveals itself, or what we are calling the truth at that time reveals itself, because this flip-flopping keeps happening, it means it's not the end of the game. And at some point we go, what am I really looking for? Like I've had enough, I've been seeking for a long time. I've had a lot of insights and realizations, and the flip-flopping keeps happening. At some point we might see that I'm lost in seeking for truth. And these truths have been, or what we can call truths have been revealed. And then we might just start to bring it back to practical and say, oh, practically speaking, I just want to be happy as, and then we might realize, oh, as the human being, but Roger is still here. So this was one of the things in meeting Ramesh is, he said to me something like, who's speaking to whom? And I said, consciousness is speaking with consciousness. And he said, Roger, don't be ridiculous. Yeah, Roger is speaking to Ramesh, and Ramesh listens. And then Ramesh speaks to Roger, and Roger listens. And I was thinking, like, what are you saying? It's taken me 4 years to realize there is no Roger and there is no Ramesh. All there is consciousness. And when I said consciousness speaking to consciousness, it wasn't just to me, it wasn't just an idea that I had read. It was an awakening that had happened. And I thought I was living the truth. And so that statement, consciousness is speaking to consciousness, to me seemed like it wasn't lost in concept. It wasn't lost in non-practical thing. And after that, I stopped and I thought, because, Ramesh just didn't agree with my stance. It's not that he didn't understand where I was coming from. I was pretty sure he understood, having gone through all of that. But I think he knew, okay, but there's more. And the more is you have to acknowledge yourself as Roger again. Having awoken to the consciousness, maybe you are not just consciousness, but maybe you are Roger, which is a body through which consciousness functions. And so what you really are is the human being, which is consciousness and the body. And so at that point hadn't the experience of a body sitting on a chair, getting in a car, getting on an airplane. And it clicked that in a way, I was obsessed with being consciousness, to the point where the notion that I am consciousness and I am not the body kept me unable to integrate back into being Roger, the body. Anyway, I don't even know where we were.
No, that's good, Roger. Yeah. I appreciate that. I really do. Yeah, I was just gonna. I guess talking. I was listening, thinking maybe this whole thing about creation just doesn't apply here with non-duality. It's a religious concept more than anything else. But anyways, I'll talk to you about it some other time. I know this is I've gone on long enough, so I'm ready to let you go and enjoy your day. Thanks, Roger.
Good one. Thanks, Frank. I think just to finish off, creation to me is, even though it is something that arises within the context of religions, and religions have their wisdom. I think they're based on wisdom, but they tend to be a little bit, they have their limitations. Within the context of non-duality, I'd say all of life is a creation or manifestation. So to me, creation is very much relevant in the field of non-duality. Experience, creation, manifestation, they're all interchangeable words. And what I think we need to see is the manifestation, the creation, the experience is a creation of form. It's a creation that arises within a framework of form and time. And yet there has to be consciousness present to be aware of that experience. And that sort of hopefully brings the two sides of the coin together. And on that note, I wish you all well.